quick review of what we were discussing kanina. We were discussing about your law, your RA008504. We also were talking about the viral entry of your HIV to your CD4 positive cells, how it is being transmitted, and we also provided a brief history regarding the virus. So right now, as medical technologists, so one of our main purpose and main goal in the laboratory is actually to provide laboratory diagnosis for our doctors, for our patients, to guide them with the prognosis and also for the treatment of our patients. So right now, what we're going to discuss is the laboratory diagnosis for your human immunodeficiency virus. So technically, we actually have two types of tests when it comes to HIV. And when I say two types, it's actually your screening test. We have your screening test, and we also have your confirmatory test for your HIV. So going back again, so reviewing us for screening test, your screening test should always have a high sensitivity and a high negative predictive value. At the same time, your confirmatory test should always have your high specificity and high positive predictive value. So for your screening test, we actually have enzyme immunoassay, we have your particle agglutination, and other screening tests for HIV antibodies. So for your confirmatory test, on the other hand, we have your Western blot, which is still being used up to this day. You can also make use of your immunofluorescence, your radioimmunoprecipitation assay, and other supplemental tests for your HIV antibody. So, sir, just one nice thing to know, your HIV is being detected using your Western blot. Okay, and when I say using your Western blot now, it is actually making use of your protein. So one quick trick on how you to memorize it is snowdrop. So snowdrop. So what do I mean by snowdrop? So for S, that stands for southern. Okay, that stands for southern, which actually detects DNA. Okay. You also have your northern blot. Your northern blot made use or detect your RNA. And on the other hand, what we have is now your western blot. Okay. We have here your western blot that make use of your proteins. Okay. They make use of proteins on the identification of a particular organism. Okay, going back here now, we have different types of laboratory diagnosis for your HIV. So it actually varies from one laboratory, from one hospital to another. So testing methods, guys, we have most of the time for your screening test, we have your rapid test kits. Okay, it can either be through your flow through rapid kits. We also have here your laminar flow rapid kits, and you also have agglutination tests for your HIV. So what one thing that I just want you to recognize or always remember is that you always have to see your control lines all the time. So this is actually one of our internal quality control when it comes to the testing for your HIV. So as you can see, when your control appears, whether it is reactive or non-reactive, we will be accepting the test. If the control line is absent, that's the time now that we discard or we disregard the test results because it is invalid. Okay, so much about that in your quality assurance instrumentation and laboratory entrepreneurship lecture. So we also have your ELISA, which we also called your enzyme link immunosorbent assay. So as you can see, a positive result indicates a yellow color, and a negative result indicates now a colorless reaction. So this is an example of ELISA plate. You can actually also make use of ELISA in many other tests, like in your syphilis and other serological testing. Okay, so moving on now, we can also have your chemiluminescence microparticle immunoassay. So here, the antigen and antibody is labeled with a molecule capable of emitting light during a chemical reaction. The light is used to measure now the antigen antibody complex. So the more antigen antibody complexes there are, so we can actually say that that is also the concentration or the probability of the presence of your viruses. So moving on, so here we have an example here of your Western blot. What we do usually, so let's have a quick and a brief run through of what we do in your Western blotting procedure. Again, in Western blotting, what we are detecting is actually the protein. So the first one is to load and separate protein samples on your SDS page. So technically, what we're doing here is an electrophoresis. Okay, an electrophoresis. So electrophoretically, we transfer the fraction protein onto your PVDF membrane. So once we transfer the content of the gel towards your membrane now, we block the membrane with a neutral protein or a BSA or milk casein, and then afterwards we incubate that membrane with with primary antibodies specific to your target protein. So sir, another question that you might be asking are, what are those target protein? We go back again to the different envelope proteins present in your HIV, and we have here your GP120, your GP51, your GP24, your GP31, your GP41, and again, going back as a review, your GP41 combined with your GP120 is actually your GP160. So, after that, after incubation of that membrane, the membrane now with the horse peroxidase labeled secondary antibody specific to the primary antibody will now also be applied. So, as you can see, okay, what we have here now and what is coming from your specimen are actually the protein. So those are in the symbol of triangles down here. So I hope you're seeing it clearly. So after that, we applied the antibodies. Those are those antibody right now. Okay, those antibody are specific to that particular antigen, specific to your GP120, 160, GP41, your P24. Okay, so take for example, you can see them here. Okay, and we apply the particular antibody directed against those antigen. So as you can see, it reacted with your antigen. So, sir, how can we visually identify now that this reaction took place? Okay, that's the $1 million question, because how are you gonna identify that? So what you're gonna use now are also antibodies. But how are these antibodies different from the primary antibody that we first applied? So these antibodies here that we're applying right now are labeled with horseradish peroxidase. Sir, what's the importance of horseradish peroxidase? So these are actually labels. O, di ba? May label, buti pa yung antibody, may labels. Tanong mo kayo nung kachat mo kung may label. So, going back now, so we have here your labels. These labels now would react, okay, would react and will now be emitting a light, and that what we call that here as a chemiluminescent. So upon the presence of a particular chemical reaction, it will now be emitting light. Okay, and that light is what will now be detected and what you are going to be seeing upon the exposure of your film. So take for example, okay, on your right, I want you to look at your right. We have this here, your strip A, B, and C. So as you can see, this is actually the membrane, okay? And the reason why you can now see the blackening of this bands is actually because of the secondary antibody that we applied. So do not be scared of what we are discussing right now, because that would be discussed further in other lessons that we will be having. So your GP160, your GP120, ayan. So how would I know now if the patient is actually HIV positive or HIV negative? So this is your Western blot. Again, this is your confirmatory test. Needs to be very specific and has a positive predictive value. So 2 out of the 3 bands, you will now hit the jackpot, and you will now be diagnosed, or you will now be diagnosed with HIV positive. So what do I mean by that? Any of the 3, your GP160, GP120, GP41, or GP24, any of those, any 2 out of 3 bands, okay, that will now signify a positive result. So that is very important. Again, that is for your Western blotting. Okay, so we go now to our law. So that was just a quick recap on what HIV is and the testing about HIV. So now we go deeper to your RA008504, also known as the Prevention and Control Philippine AIDS Prevention and Control Act of 1998. So, moving on, we have in section 2 the declaration of policies. So, what this law aims is actually public awareness, and through comprehensive and nationwide educational and information campaign. So that's why right now you might be seeing the post coming from your love yourself. So right now we actually have an increasing public awareness, especially when former Miss Universe Pia back and former Miss Universe Catriona Gray, they actually included HIV as one of their advocacies. Okay, so aside from that, this also aims for a full protection of the human rights and civil liberties of persons suspected or known to be infected with HIV and AIDS, and we call them person living with HIV or your PLHIV. So this goal aims to protect them against discrimination either in their workplaces or other by in cyberbullying. So technically, this law covers them. Aside from that, we also aims to have a safety and universal precaution and practices and procedures that carry risk of HIV transmission. So we go back again to most of the medical procedures that we do, which medical technologists are very much exposed to. So all of those things are under this law as well. So positively address and seek to eradicate conditions that aggravate the spread of HIV infection. So going back to its title, prevention and control. We don't just want to control, or we don't just want to properly manage our patients, but we also want to have an end to this and to this infection. So technically, all possible ways from your post-prophylactic exposure to your antiretroviral drug, even your pre-exposure prophylaxis, your PrEP, we also have that now. So all of those things are also being included. So aside from that, participation of affected individuals and propagating vital information and educational messages about HIV/AIDS. So eventually, I don't know if you still remember during your CPH, we also invited guests to talk about HIV/AIDS. So right now, one of these days we'll try to also look out for individuals who will be willing to share their experience. So people living with HIV to share their experiences, and eventually our goal is to really eradicate the negative stigma that comes along HIV. So we have some definitions that we need to define today. We have some terms rather to define today. So what is acquired immune deficiency syndrome? So this is now caused by HIV infection, and I hope by this time you know the difference now between your HIV and your AIDS, because they are not the same. So AIDS happens when your immune system is weakened and being attacked by foreign or opportunistic infections, making the afflicted individual more susceptible to other life-threatening infections. That's why most of the time, your HIV/AIDS is just an underlying cause of death. So most of the time, the intermediate or the antecedent cause of death is actually different. So take for example, it could either be pneumonia, it can either be flu, meningitis, other bacterial, parasitic, or even viral infections that make that individual very much that made that um, individual very susceptible to the disease. Aside from that, we also have here compulsory HIV testing. So lack of consent. So use of physical force, intimidation, or any form of compulsion. So HIV testing is not mandatory, it's not compulsory, it should be voluntary. Okay, it should be voluntary. And what do we mean by voluntary HIV testing? This is your patient willingly submits him or herself to such tests after having undergone a pre-test counseling. So having mentioned of the pre-test counseling, so we have a pre-test and a post-test counseling, and it's very important before you conduct the test and even after you release a particular result. Aside from that, we also have contact tracing. This is a method of finding the and counseling the sexual partner or partners of a person who has been diagnosed with as having STD. So similar to what's happening right now in coronavirus, once that a particular patient is tested positive, they actually would be doing contact tracing. So we're looking for individuals who have been exposed to that individual, to that virus. So also have high risk behavior. So what do we mean by that? This refers to persons' frequent involvement in certain activity which increase the risk of transmitting or acquiring HIV. So it can either be through um, sexual intercourse or blood transfusion or IV drugs. So all of those things, even your promiscuous act will be asked as well. Aside from that, we also have your informed consent. So this is very important. Voluntary agreement of a person to undergo or be subjected to a procedure based on full information. So you will be answering a particular questionnaires with all informations alongside with it. So it's very important to have that to document your voluntary and um your willing testing for the test for the HIV. So medical confidentiality is very important, not only because of the Data Privacy Act, but even before the Data Privacy Act, medical confidentiality is very important. So the relationship of trust and confidence created or existing between a patient or a person with HIV and the healthcare worker and personnel involved is very important. Okay? It is very important. So many people would actually be seeing posts in the internet of informations that should not be disclosed in the public. So as medical practitioners, as medical technologists, doctors, it is our job not just to preserve the life of our patient but also to preserve their quality of life. And by me saying quality of life, we also talk about their privacy. Okay, so we also have your window period. So technically, a window period which an infected individual will still test negative upon HIV testing, but can actually transmit the infection. So this is around 2 weeks to 6 months after your exposure to to HIV. So technically, your window period. This is when your body technically is already infected. It's just that serologically, or should I say, during testing with your diagnostic kits, you still be testing negative. Okay? But during those time, during the window period, you can already be transmitting the disease. Okay? You will be transmitting the disease already. So ayan, so going back now to pre-test counseling. So it refers now to the process of providing an individual information on the biomedical aspects of HIV/AIDS and emotional support to any psychological implications of undergoing HIV testing and the test result itself before he or she is subjected to the test. So it's very important for us to talk to our patients. So there is actually a separate training for individuals, for medical technologists, medical practitioners who want to be able to test the specimens, and there's a separate training for HIV counseling. So it's very important that individuals, health practitioners should talk to the individual first before the testing, because as any diseases goes, when you are being tested for a particular disease, there is anxiety and sometimes there is discomfort when in terms of when it comes to our patients. So it's very important to be explaining the test to them very well, the implication of the test, and the implication of either a positive and a negative result. Which leads me now to my second point, the post-test counseling. This now refers to the process of providing the risk reduction information and emotional support to a person who submitted to HIV testing at the time that the test result is released. So, whether or not it is positive or negative, reactive or non-reactive rather, we still have to do your post-test counseling. It is, and this one is at most important. It is very, very important because your post-test counseling, you have to talk to your patients before you release them, or before you let them go from your health facility. Okay, so we're providing risk reduction information. Take for example, telling them to avoid sexual intercourses or promiscuous act or blood donation. And at the same time, we're also giving them emotional support. Right now in Facebook, we actually have numerous support groups happening. You can have your Pulang Laso, you have your your PNAC, and all other support groups available. Okay, so aside from that, so we go now to the different articles. As mentioned a while back, we have 9 articles, and your 52 sections are divided into those 9 articles. The first article talks about the education and information. So the government must promote education and information campaigns. So technically, our government is our government, with the help of DOH, is actually promoting and informing our community, our students, different stakeholders of the society with regards to HIV. So technically, schools and even non-formal education program must include HIV education. Okay, so whether or not you are in the medical field or non-medical field, HIV education, sex education is very important. The DOH must also conduct public health education campaign. So I don't know if you would actually visit the website of DOH and go to their DOH programs, you'd actually be seeing their campaigns against AIDS, HIV. So aside from that, the government must also provide education for Filipinos going abroad. So technically, this is might actually be part of the pre-departure seminar of the pre-departure seminar that is being conducted by our government. So local government units must also develop a local HIV prevention and education efforts, especially nowadays that individuals testing positive to HIV is actually as young as 15 now. So, as young as 15, even 12 years old. So, technically, it's not just about educating them about HIV per se, but all other sexually transmitted diseases. So, it is against the law to give false or intentionality misleading information on HIV/AIDS. So we need to be careful on how we disseminate information with regards to HIV/AIDS, because as mentioned in this law, we should not be giving false and misleading information to the general public. Okay, so next one is the second article, talks about safe practices and procedures. So technically, this is for us medical practitioners. So the government should develop and promote safe medical practices. So as mentioned in our previous law, the National Blood Banking Law, all blood all bloods, organ, and tissue for donation will be tested before transplantation or before transfusion. So technically, if it tests positive, it will be disposed it should be disposed of safely and should not be used for any medical purposes anymore. Whether it is for educational or whatsoever, you should not use it anymore. Aside from that, the DOH should also provide guidelines on safe surgery and medical procedure. So again, universal precaution, always remember that. And of course, willfully and negligently dangerous practices will be against the law. So technically, um, all practices, um, all practices, medical practices, is being governed by this law as well, whether it is blood transfusion or whether it is organ donation. So it's very important to talk about that. So when it comes to, let's just discuss this first. So when it comes to blood, organs, and tissue donation, you might be asking, what about the HIV testing? Would it be with consent or without consent? The moment that the individual submitted him or herself for blood donation, for organ or tissue donation, it is already part of the pre-counseling and even in the donor recruitment, that they will be informed that HIV testing will be done in their blood units or in their organ. Okay, that's very important. Aside from that, we also have in Article 3 the testing, screening, and counseling. Okay, so the government will provide appropriate confidential HIV testing. And right now, our confirmatory testing is actually happening in San Lazaro Hospital, the National Reference Laboratory for sexually transmitted diseases. So going back now for the testing, for the screening test, all laboratories that has a HIV proficient medical technologist or HIV proficient healthcare worker could do the testing. Okay? So going back now to your clinical laboratory law, we have there your license to operate. But on top of your license to operate, you also need to have an HIV proficient medical technologist to perform the testing, even if that is only your screening test. So HIV testing can only be done with the consent of the person being tested. So it's very important. So there are no such thing as a private HIV testing or a compulsory HIV testing. So the DOH will provide anonymous HIV testing. So take for example, you went into a laboratory and you have yourself tested for HIV. What will happen is that your if take for example in the laboratory you tested positive, your result will not immediately be released and will be declared as HIV positive. What will they do is actually forward that to our National Reference Laboratory, which is San Lazaro Hospital, for confirmatory testing, your Western blot. So what will happen there now, the DOH will provide you an anonymous HIV testing. So technically, there's a particular naming procedure on how your samples are being named. So technically, your names, take for example Juan de la Cruz, will not be put in that um tube or in the test tubes. So technically, it's a coded or a barcoded identifier. So counseling, aside from that, will also be conducted before and after the testing. So this is one thing I am being very particular of because it's very important. And aside from that, the DOH will also make adequate and affordable HIV testing available in all of the Philippines. So if you're going to ask, sir, are we paying for the confirmatory testing? We do not. Technically, we actually just send your samples to San Lazaro Hospital for confirmatory testing. Afterwards, we actually send it to your laboratory, and then the laboratory will be doing the post counseling and the releasing of the results. Okay? So technically, one main rule here is that once your screening test once your screening test tested negative, you can automatically release that. But if it is positive rather, you have to hold the results first. So I am only talking about the protocol in our laboratory. So technically, we usually instruct our patients to come back 2 weeks after the testing. Yes, 2 weeks. Maybe you're asking why 2 weeks? That's too long. So technically, whether you're positive or whether you're reactive or non-reactive, we're actually releasing it after 2 weeks. For the reason that there are actually patients who will be testing positive to our screening tests. And then when we submitted that to the National Reference Laboratory, it will actually come back non-reactive or negative. So technically, 'di ba? So to just narrow down just to standardize the releasing of results, and technically to avoid na syempre most of our patients, pag once they realize that their result is taking longer than the usual, mag-iisip sila that they might actually have the disease already, even without the final results or the confirmatory results. So it's very important. Again, depending on the protocol of your hospital or your laboratory, you have to follow that. So, conduct of HIV testing. So, for reactive samples during screening tests, so from patients, okay, we have to submit them or we have to forward them as STD/AIDS Cooperative Central Laboratory, SACEL, that is also your San Lazaro Hospital. And for reactive blood units, okay, for reactive blood units, we will be forwarding them to the Research Institute for Tropical Medicine or your RITM. So this is under your DOH Circular number 224 series of 2004. So aside from that, also included in your Article 3 is that no compulsory HIV testing should be done. Only voluntary HIV testing is encouraged among high-risk individuals. So the testing should be obtained. They should obtain written informed consent with person of legal age and from parents or legal guardian for minor or mentally incapacitated. So when it comes to the legal age, I will also be discussing something later on, because in another law, there's actually a repealed version of this law already that talks about um, allowing individuals as young as 15 years old to have their HIV testing without parents' consent or even guardian consent. So aside from that, we also have some prohibitions on the compulsory HIV testing. So precondition to employment, so that's prohibited by this law. Admission to educational institution, entry or continued stay in the country, right to travel, provision of medical service or any other kind of services, or the continued enjoyment of said undertaking shall be deemed unlawful. So take for example, in a particular company, they are actually asking you to have your HIV screening first before you got employed. Please be reminded of 8504, because under that law, you cannot um you cannot um you cannot force anyone to have their own HIV screening. Aside from that, um either in schools or traveling to another country, even getting a service, medical service, HIV is not compulsory to anything. Okay? Aside from that, exemption to the prohibition on compulsory testing. Okay? So these are now people who committed crime under the revised penal code. So technically, everyone who committed crime is exempted. So technically, we can have their HIV screening with or without their permission. So when the determination of HIV status is necessary to resolve the relevant issue under Family Code of the Philippines, and also compliance with the organ and blood donation, so your RA7170 or the organ donation law and your RA7719. Okay, so please remember this law. So technically your RA7719 and RA7170, when under that, we can have your HIV testing with or without their permission. Okay, so aside from that, we also have here your health and support services, which is article number 4. So the government will ensure adequate health and support services for people living with HIV. So hospitals will provide adequate care for persons with HIV. Your local government units must also provide community-based prevention and care efforts. Aside from that, we should also provide them livelihood efforts will also be made available to people with HIV. So the DOH is what they need to do is actually to have an STD prevention and control efforts. So whether it is HIV or not, they have to do that. And aside from that, the DOH is also to make sure that health insurance is available to people with HIV. So right now, um, with what's happening with most of our HIV patient is that they're actually receiving free consultation. They're actually some actually are having free viral load testing, free CD4 count for for this patient. So usually they go to the RITM. And to tell you honestly, the antiretroviral drug is for free. Okay? It's for free. So usually they actually have a monthly supply of their antiretroviral drug. So aside from that, for most of our patients, okay, for most of our patients, sir, if the medications or the antiretroviral drug is for free, how could the government sustain that? This is actually through the PhilHealth. So all your HIV positive patients are actually being encouraged. So actually, that's the exchange deal there. So they're actually being encouraged to have their PhilHealth, and they actually pay for their own PhilHealth. If they're not working, if you're working, then that's good. You already have your PhilHealth, but technically, the payment actually is in the form of their PhilHealth contribution. Again, not bad because that PhilHealth contribution is also for them. Okay, so that is now their health insurance eventually. Okay, so hopefully everything's clear. So moving on, we now have your Article 5 which talks about your monitoring. Okay? So the government now will monitor your HIV AIDS. Yes, they monitor your HIV AIDS, whether the number of patients now, whether it is growing or not. They have to monitor that. So the government will establish your AIDS Watch Council. So they're also responsible in reporting procedures will be developed to track HIV rates while respecting client confidentiality. So technically, they can actually just simply get the information from the NRL, the SACL SLH, because all the informations taken from that particular from our national reference laboratory could actually be used for epidemiological purposes. And aside from that, when it comes to contact tracing, it is also being permitted, provided that confidentiality is not breached. So technically, they can actually be they could actually be tracing the different individuals that has been exposed to this. But right now, I don't know if they're still doing contact tracing when it comes to HIV, like how tedious the contact tracing that they are doing in coronavirus today. So technically, with what was shared to me before is that, take for example, you have a HIV patient who is positive. That patient would now encourage his or her partner or partners to have themselves tested as well. Okay, for Article 6, it talks about the confidentiality now. So confidentiality will be protected on HIV status. So medical confidentiality, again, is very important. This is between your patient and the medical practitioner, the healthcare workers. So exemptions to the mandate of confidentiality. So number one, this are when complying with reportorial rep, reportorial requirements of your HIV/AIDS monitoring program. Aside from that, when informing other health workers directly involved about or to be involved in the treatment of a patient with HIV/AIDS. So technically, an example of this, what's happening is that, take for example, when I was in in the practice before, usually we have a particular paper posted in every machine. So take for example, that's a hematological or a clinical chemistry machine. We have there a code for the patient. So take for example, for Juan de la Cruz, the code for Juan de la Cruz is JJDC123. Okay? And then what will be posted there is that it's not JJDC123 has HIV. It's not like that. So technically, what will be posted there is that JJDC123 practice universal precaution. So usually, once that is posted, technically we should always practice universal precaution. But technically, how much we should be taking care um or we should be handling those specimens with utmost care. So those things are also being posted in the laboratory. So aside from that, when responding to subpoena duces tecum or subpoena duces ad testificandum, so these are not the exemptions to the mandate of confidentiality. So when they are asking you to bring documents now, or they are asking you to bring or to testify in front of the court, so medical confidentiality, again, all health professionals, medical instructors, workers, employers, recruitment agency, insurance company data encoders, and other custodians of medical records, file data, or test results are directed to strictly observe confidentiality in handling all medical information, particularly the identity and the status of person with HIV. To tell you honestly, whether or not it is HIV or not, we should all treat patients' information with utmost respect and medical confidentiality. Not just because of this law, but it's also included in the Medical Technology Code of Ethics. Okay, so for Article 6, we also have the confidentiality will also be protected on HIV status. So HIV result may be given to first the person tested, either parent is if the patient is a minor, or a legal guardian in case of insane persons or orphans, and also an official of the AIDS Watch Council and the Justice of the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court. Okay, but going back to the HIV result. So take for example, let's have a scenario here. Take for example, you have Juan de la Cruz who tested positive with HIV. He progressed to AIDS and eventually died without technically. Take for example, Juan de la Cruz is already 25 years old, no longer a minor. Okay, no longer a minor, and he chooses to keep it a secret to everyone around him. Can the doctor disclose to the family that Juan de la Cruz died because of HIV? So, any answers? No. The answer is no. The doctor cannot disclose it to their family. Okay? The doctor cannot disclose it to their family. Given that the person is no longer a minor and he chooses not to disclose it to anyone, you cannot do that. You can only do that if the patient are minor. Okay? The patient is minor, or the patient is insane or not in sound mind, or are orphans. Okay? So, technically, if a person died, even if the doctor knew in the very first place that that the underlying cause of death is actually AIDS HIV, they cannot disclose it. But technically, they can still disclose the immediate cause of death. Like for example, pneumonia, meningitis, or any other infections or conditions. So legal penalties can be provided for breaching confidentiality. So you can be penalized because of this. Aside from that, people with HIV must inform spouses and sex partners as soon as reasonably possible. So this is very important. We actually encourage most of our patients to do this. Before, we had the patient that he is a father, he's a guy, he has a family, but he actually tested positive. So during that time, his wife and his daughter needs to undergo HIV screening as well, because the father tested positive. So fortunately, the mother and actually the child tested negative to HIV at that time. So, aside from that, we also have Article number 7, which is a discriminatory act and policy. So, discrimination against people with HIV is illegal. So, employers cannot discriminate in hiring, firing, promotion, or assignment based on actual or suspected HIV status. Going back to the mandatory or compulsory HIV testing. So any company, schools, institution cannot do that to you. At the same time, if you're already tested positive or suspected to have HIV, they cannot also hold that against you against any promotion or hiring, or technically they cannot even fire you just because of that. Schools are also not allowed to refuse admission or punish a student or deny participation in activities based on real or perceived HIV status. So technically, if you are an HIV patient and you plan to go to med school, to law school, they can and they must admit you regardless of your HIV status. So, a person with HIV has the legal right to travel, to live, and launch with the same freedom as any other citizen. So, quarantines are and other restrictions are illegal. Okay? They are all illegal. So, technically, they cannot isolate you or anything just because you are having a particular infection such as HIV. Okay? So moving on now to Article 7 as well. A person with HIV has every legal right to seek public office. So if you for HIV patient, if they feel like they actually they actually are being discriminated, they can actually go to any public offices to report it. So credit services cannot be denied based on HIV status. Insurance cannot be refused based on HIV status, provided the person does not lie about their HIV status. So when it comes to this one with the insurance, there are actually a lot of hindrances, obstacles hampering a particular patient to get their own insurance, whether it is whatever insurance company. It would really take a long time. So aside from that, hospitals and health services cannot refuse treatment or discriminate based on HIV status. That's a big no-no. So decent burial cannot be denied based on HIV status as well. Legal penalties for discrimination will also be enforced. So before we move on to Article 8, I just want you all to realize that discrimination among HIV patients is illegal. And this is one thing that we all have to really take a look at on how we um treat them and live with them, because a lot of people with HIV are still good people at the end of the day. They are moral at the end of the day, and some are actually part of very important processes in our government, in our academies, in our respective lives. And it is very, very important to also respect them. This is one of the things that RA008504 is also aiming, not only preventing and controlling the disease, but spreading awareness and also protecting people living with HIV. So, moving on now to Article number 8, the Philippine National AIDS Council. The government will establish a Philippine National AIDS Council, which we all know as PNAC. It was actually created in December 3, 1992 by an executive order number 39. So as you can see, it was actually December 1992. It was actually around that time when Dolzura Cortez, the first female Filipino infected with HIV, went into the public to share her story. So it was around that time that the Philippine National AIDS Council, even without the RA008504 at that time, was founded. So they actually was to oversee and integrate the comprehensive approach to HIV/AIDS prevention and control in the Philippines. So they are actually composed of 26 members. So the council envisioned a fully empowered national coordinating body where different individuals and sectors work in partnership to prevent the transmission of the virus and lessen its impact on the affected person, in particular in society in general. So the Philippine National AIDS Council again was founded December 3, 1992 through your executive order number 39. Okay, so what is now the function of your PNAC? So they function as to secure recommendation and ensure coverage in information and education monitoring guidelines in medical and other practices and procedures, health and support services, testing and counseling, protection of rights, observance of confidentiality. They also are to monitor the IRR, issue or cause issuance or order or recommend. They also need to develop and monitor comprehensive and long-term program with regards to HIV/AIDS, to coordinate and strengthen working relationships with government and non-government agencies, and also to coordinate and cooperate with foreign and international organizations. They also should evaluate adequacy and recommend the utilization of resources. So, why do we have to monitor HIV/AIDS? So, we have to determine the magnitude and progression of HIV/AIDS. So, your vital data, the morbidity, the mortality rates are very important in the next step of the government of the DOH. So, whether they're going to impose more programs or they were going to impose um free treatment or whatsoever that will be, they should be guided by those information, by those vital data. So evaluate, they also need to evaluate the adequacy and efficacy of our countermeasures. So technically, we're trying to look at the effectivity or the impact of the programs that we are doing with our patients. So how do we monitor? We have institutionalizing the National AIDS Registry. Aside from that, we are reporting of all cases in hospitals, clinic, laboratories, and accredited testing centers. So technically, all positive tests are being reported. So each laboratories are making annual reports that will be submitted to the National Reference Laboratory, and on the other hand, we ensure the anonymity of those who are being tested for HIV. Okay, so for article number 9, we have miscellaneous provisions. Where under article number 9 is your sections 49 through 59, which talk about the implementing rules and regulations, the separability clause, the repealing clause, and the effectivity. Okay, so that will be all for today. To summarize everything, so these are the list of the different articles that we discussed from articles 1 through 9. So if you have any questions, just message me or comment down below. Just comment down below. And aside from that, I'll be cutting the video for today, and after which I will be discussing some very quick details regarding your 8504 with our next video. So please stay tuned, and that will be all for this time. I hope to see you on our next video in a while back.